Charlotte Whitfield had never imagined her life would lead her to a crowded train station in the middle of nowhere, clutching a worn satchel that contained all she owned. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and dust, the rumble of trains echoing in her chest. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the gnawing truth settling deeper into her heart. She had been abandoned. Months earlier, she had answered an ad placed by a widower in the Western Gazette. The man, a rancher by the name of Thomas Harlan, had written kind words, promising stability, partnership, and a home. For Charlotte, whose life had been one disappointment after another, her parents gone, her brother lost to war, and a series of thankless positions as a seamstress and housemaid, the letter felt like a lifeline. A chance to belong, to build, something new, far away from the echo of loneliness that haunted her in the city. The long journey west had been filled with nervous hope. She had pressed his letters to her chest at night in the rattling coach, whispering the words as if they were scripture. I will welcome you with open arms. I need a woman's gentle touch in my home, and I will give you the respect you deserve. She had pictured his face countless times, rehearsed what she would say when she stepped off the train and he came forward to claim her. But when she arrived, bonnet neat and hands folded, it wasn't Thomas H. The sun had begun to sink lower by the time Charlotte wiped her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief. Hours had passed since she'd been told the man who had written her letters, the man she'd crossed miles of prairie for, had already wed another, just weeks before her arrival. She had no money for return fare, no relatives waiting in the East, and no one here to claim her. Every time she thought of it, the humiliation burned deeper. She was alone, and the world seemed to know it. She sat on a weathered bench at the edge of the platform, her small satchel at her feet, trying to summon the strength to rise and walk into the dusty little town. Perhaps she could find work sewing or cleaning. Perhaps she could disappear quietly, before the station master grew tired of her presence. But the weight of her rejection pressed heavily, making even the act of standing feel impossible. It was then that she noticed the child. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, hovered a few steps away. She was barefoot, her dress faded from too many washes, a single ribbon holding back a tumble of golden-brown hair. In her arms, she clutched a ragged doll whose stuffing bulged from one seam. What struck Charlotte most were the child's eyes, large, watchful, the sort that saw too much for someone so young. Charlotte gave a weak smile, expecting the girl to shy away. But instead, the child took a step closer, tilting her head curiously. "Are you crying?" the girl asked, her voice soft but steady. Charlotte quickly dabbed her eyes again, embarrassed. "No, dear. Just a bit of dust in my eye, I suppose." The child didn't look convinced. She hugged her doll tighter, then studied Charlotte the way only children can, unflinching, sincere. After a pause, she said, "You look awful sad, like you got left behind." The words pierced sharper than any adult's pity could. Charlotte's throat tightened, and she whispered, "I suppose I did." The girl's little brow furrowed, as though she were solving a puzzle. Then she stepped even closer until she was standing right in front of Charlotte, her chin lifted bravely. "Well?" The moment Annie's small hand tugged at Charlotte's sleeve and guided her across the dusty street, Charlotte's heart leapt into her throat. She wanted to resist, to explain that she couldn't simply walk into someone's home uninvited, but the child's determination was stronger than her hesitation. Annie carried herself with the boldness of someone who had long been used to making decisions beyond her years. They left behind the bustle of the station and wound their way down, a dirt road that led toward the edge of town. There, beyond the mercantile and the blacksmith's shop, the land opened up into wide stretches of prairie. A ranch house stood in the distance, sturdy though weather-worn, with a corral nearby and a handful of cattle grazing. Charlotte's breath caught, not because of the land itself, but because she realized where Annie was leading her. "Wait," Charlotte said softly, slowing her steps. "Sweetheart, your family. They don't know me. I can't just—" But Annie only looked back with a matter-of-fact expression that left no room for argument. "Uncle Matt don't like most folks anyway. You won't be worse than the rest." The girl marched forward, dragging Charlotte along until they reached the porch. The screen door creaked, and out stepped a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with the kind of strength born of long days in the sun. But it wasn't his build that startled Charlotte. It was his eyes. They were sharp, wary, and filled with the kind of guardedness she knew too well. "Annie," he said in a low, gravelly tone, "what have I told you about dragging strays home?" Charlotte stiffened at the word stray, heat rising in her cheeks. Annie, however, was undeterred. She pushed her little doll into Charlotte's hands as though it were a peace offering and announced, "She's not a stray, she's my new mama." The first days on Matthew's ranch were the hardest Charlotte had ever known. Not because of the work, though it was endless, but because of the way Matthew's silence weighed heavier than any chore. He had allowed her to stay under his roof only after Annie's tearful pleading, but his conditions had been clear. "You can sleep in the spare room," he'd said flatly, arms crossed as if building a wall between them. "Don't expect wages. Don't expect special treatment. You'll be gone once you figure out where else to go." The words had stung, but Charlotte had nodded, clutching her satchel to her chest. She had no illusions. She was only a guest, tolerated because of Annie's stubbornness. And yet, even in his hardness, Matthew had given her shelter, and she would not waste the chance. The very next morning, Charlotte rose before dawn. She lit the stove, brewed coffee, and set about preparing breakfast with what she could find: cornmeal, a slab of bacon, and a few eggs gathered fresh from the coop. By the time Matthew trudged in from the barn, sweat already dampening his collar, the kitchen smelled of crisp bacon and warm bread. He stopped in the doorway, surprised, though he tried to hide it. Annie clapped her hands delightedly and declared, "See, Uncle Matt? I told you she belongs here." Days turned into weeks, and though Charlotte had found a rhythm in the household, she carried her secrets as carefully as she carried Annie's hand across the barnyard. She smiled when spoken to, worked hard from morning until dusk, and never once complained about the aches in her back or the blisters on her palms. But inside, shadows lingered. It was Annie, as always, who first began to tug those shadows into the light. One evening after supper, when the dishes were stacked neatly, on the drying board, Charlotte sat mending a tear in Annie's dress by lamplight. The little girl sprawled on the rug, her doll beside her, watching Charlotte's needle dart in and out of the fabric. "Where's your family?" Annie asked suddenly, her tone innocent, but her eyes searching. Charlotte's hand faltered, the needle snagging the hem. For a moment she considered the easy answer, far away, but Annie's gaze was too earnest, too piercing. So Charlotte sighed softly and said, "I had a family once. My parents passed on when I was just a bit older. Then you. My brother went to fight in the war and never came back." Annie sat up, hugging her knees. "So you were all alone?" Charlotte nodded. "I worked as a seamstress in the city for years. Long hours, little pay, and even then folks weren't if—" There was one thing Charlotte had learned in her short time on the ranch. It was that Annie Harlan was a child with a stubborn will and a heart full of schemes. Once the little girl had decided on something, there was no force on earth that could sway her. And lately, her determination was fixed on a single mission: convincing her uncle that Charlotte was meant to be more than a temporary guest. It began with small, almost innocent gestures. At supper one evening, Charlotte noticed Annie had set 3 plates at the table instead of 2, arranging them neatly side by side. "Mama should sit here," Annie declared with a bright smile, tugging at Charlotte's sleeve until she took the chair between them. Matthew, weary from a long day driving cattle, frowned at the arrangement. "Annie," he warned, "don't start." But Annie only batted her lashes. "I'm not starting anything, Uncle Matt. I'm finishing. Families sit together." Charlotte's cheeks burned, but she stayed silent, smoothing her napkin across her lap. Matthew muttered under his breath but didn't move the place setting, and that, to Annie, was a victory. The next attempt came on a Sunday morning. Charlotte had been braiding Annie's hair into 2 neat plaits when the child chirped, "Don't you think Uncle Matt ought to have his shirt ironed proper for church? A wife would do that." Charlotte nearly dropped the ribbon she was tying. "Annie," she whispered, "hush now." But Annie only grinned. "You'd do it better than he ever could." Life on the ranch had begun to fall into a steady rhythm. Charlotte found her hands had grown stronger, her back straighter, and her confidence steadier with each passing day. Annie flourished with her laughter echoing through the house again, and even Matthew, though still guarded, seemed a shade less grim when Charlotte was near. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home. But peace on the prairie was never guaranteed, and it wasn't long before hardship came knocking. It started with the skies. Rain had not fallen for weeks, and the once verdant pastures, where the cattle grazed, turned brittle and brown. Matthew walked the fields each morning, his expression hardening as he bent to crush the dry grass between his calloused fingers. "Won't last much longer," he muttered one evening, staring out over the horizon. Charlotte, watching him from the porch as she rocked Annie to sleep, saw the storm brewing inside him, though not a drop of rain came from the heavens above. The drought meant feed would have to be. The drought's grip on the land weighed on everyone, but the strain it pressed onto Matthew seemed to run deeper than the parched earth itself. He grew quieter by the day, his brow furrowed in constant thought, and though Charlotte tried to ease the burdens where she could, stretching meals, mending old clothes, helping Annie with her lessons, her very presence seemed to stir a different kind of storm inside him. It was Annie, as always, who bridged the distance. She chattered at supper, telling stories of the calves she had seen kicking their legs in the pasture, or how Charlotte had taught her to knead bread dough without getting flour in her hair. Matthew listened, but his replies grew shorter, his smiles rarer. Charlotte noticed, too, how his eyes lingered on her hands as she passed him a dish, or on her face when she read aloud to Annie by lamplight. It wasn't indifference that shadowed him. It was fear. One evening, after a long day, repairing a section of fence, Matthew came into the kitchen just as Charlotte was ladling soup into bowls. Annie had. The night Charlotte feared most arrived when the drought turned from hardship into crisis. The ranch's well, strained for weeks, finally ran dry. Cattle bawled restlessly in the fields, their ribs beginning to show. Matthew stood in the yard, long after sundown, his hat in his hands, staring at the dark horizon as though sheer will might draw rain from the heavens. Charlotte watched him through the kitchen window, her heart twisting. She had seen him bear hardship before, shoulders square, jaw set like iron. But this was the look of a man who believed he had failed everyone depending on him. She set aside the loaf she had been slicing and stepped out onto the porch. "Matthew," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He glanced at her, his eyes hollow. "There's nothing left to do. The cattle'll die, the land'll go barren. I can't hold this place together any longer." Charlotte's instinct was to reassure, to remind him of his resilience. But before she could speak, a small cry sounded from inside the house. Annie Charlotte hurried in, Matthew close behind. They found Annie curled in her narrow bed, her cheeks flushed with fever. The little girl's breaths came shallow and fast, her tiny fists tangled in the bedsheet. "Uncle Matt," she whimpered. "Don't let go." Panic shot through Matthew's face like lightning. He sat at Annie's side, gripping her small hand. Charlotte fetched a cool cloth, pressing it to Annie's forehead. The fever burned hot under her touch, and fear rose sharp in Charlotte's throat. Annie was the thread holding them all together. If she slipped away, everything would unravel. Need the doctor? Charlotte urged. Now! Matthew didn't hesitate. He saddled his horse in record time, spurred it hard, and vanished down the moonlit road toward town. Charlotte stayed behind, whispering comfort to Annie, rocking her, gently though she was far too big to cradle. For hours she prayed, wiping the child's brow, murmuring promises she dared not know if she could keep. At last, just before dawn, Matthew returned with the doctor in tow. The man examined Annie quickly, then left a packet of medicine and instructions. Before heading back to his other patients, too many sick children in town, the fever broke with the sunrise. Charlotte had drifted half asleep in the chair by Annie's bedside when she felt a tiny hand reach for hers. Blinking awake, she found Annie's big brown eyes open, clearer than they had been all night. "You stayed," Annie whispered, her lips curling into the faintest smile. Charlotte pressed the child's hand to her cheek, relief flooding through her. "Of course I did, sweetheart. I'll always stay." From the doorway, Matthew stood watching, his hat clutched in his hands. He looked exhausted, his face shadowed with worry, but there was something else in his expression, something softer, something Charlotte hadn't dared hope to see. For the next several days, Charlotte and Matthew worked side by side to nurse Annie back to health. Charlotte prepared broths and cool compresses, while Matthew told his niece stories at night, his deep voice soothing her restless sleep. In those quiet hours, their walls began to crumble. Neither spoke of the fear they'd felt when Annie's life seemed to hang by a thread, but the shared memory bound them tighter than words ever could. It was on the fifth evening, when Annie was well enough to sit up and play with her doll again, that Charlotte found herself alone with Matthew on the porch. The prairie stretched wide before them, painted gold by the setting sun. A breeze stirred the dry grass, carrying with it the faint promise of rain. Matthew cleared his throat, but for a long moment he didn't speak. His hands gripped the porch railing as if bracing against something heavy. Finally, he turned to her. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You've done for Annie what I—" His voice faltered, and he shook his head. "Truth is, I've been too much of a coward to admit what I see plain as day." Charlotte's heart raced. "And what is that?" she asked, her voice barely above, a whisper. "That you belong here," he said simply. His eyes met hers, steady and earnest. "Not just as a helper, not just because Annie wants you, because I do. Because this house and this ranch, my life, it's empty without you in it." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. For so long she had carried the weight of rejection, of being unwanted, of never finding a place to call her own. And now, here was this man, weathered by loss, opening his heart to her. "I thought you didn't trust me," she whispered. "I didn't trust myself," Matthew admitted. "I've lost before, and it near broke me. I was scared of losing again. But I see now. I'd rather risk my heart than let fear keep me from the family standing right in front of me." Charlotte pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Before she could answer, the screen door banged open, and Annie appeared, her doll in her arms and a mischievous grin on her face. "Uncle Matt," she announced, "are you asking her to be my mama yet? 'Cause I've been waiting a real long time." Charlotte laughed through her tears, and Matthew's mouth curved into a sheepish smile. He bent down, scooped Annie into his arms, and looked straight at Charlotte. "Well," he said, voice low but steady, "guess I'd best not keep her waiting." He shifted Annie to one hip and extended his free hand to Charlotte. "Charlotte Whitfield, will you stay? Will you be my wife? And Annie's mama?" The world seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte stared at the rough, calloused hand stretched toward her, then at Annie's bright, hopeful eyes. Warmth flooded her chest, melting years of loneliness. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll be both." Annie squealed with delight, throwing her arms around. "Both of them." Matthew pulled Charlotte close, his arms strong around her shoulders. For the first time, Charlotte felt anchored, not as someone's burden, not as someone forsaken, but as part of a family. The drought would end in time, the land would recover, and life would bring its trials again. But as the three of them stood on the porch, framed by the golden light of evening, Charlotte knew they would weather whatever came, together.